Zapraszamy do sali. W jaki sposób można wrzucić ekran na ekran? No po prostu chcemy coś pokazać na sieci. Dobra, dziękuję. Proszę Państwa, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, dzień dobry. Wszyscy dobrze wyspali? Kawy mieli? Śniadanko? Telefony wszystkie wyłączone? O, może mój nie trzeba wyłączyć? Już daję przykład. I'm giving you the good example. Okay. Proszę Państwa, ladies and gentlemen, we have a few minutes before we have our first speaker, and on the agenda was a item called logistics, organizational matters, sprawy, organizacyjne. I would just like to mention that we draw your attention on Tuesday. We are all gathering for the March of the Generation's Memory, Pamięć Pokoleń. Please, if you have any questions about that, come and speak to me, because it's very important. Every year we do participate. We've got a large banner. We march from the Katyń Museum, where there are the ceremonies. We march to the Pomnik Poległych Pomordowanych na Wschodzie, the monument of the murdered and the perished in the East. And that's always a very important tradition for us to show a good Kresy-Syberia turnout. So if you have any questions or any doubts, jeśli są jakieś wątpliwości, proszę zwrócić do mnie, bo chcę mieć jak największą, prawda, publiczność w naszej grupie, żeby pokazać, że jesteśmy, że pamiętamy. Dobra? Więc to będzie we wtorek. Msza jest w katedrze polowej o 12:00. The mass is at the cathedral, the Army Cathedral. It's not in the Katyń Museum this year. It's different than last year. So at 12:00 we're meeting at the Army Cathedral. The address is on the program, ulica Długa, and then we will have a transport. We're going to arrange for at least 10 people to be transported by bus to the Katyń Museum. If you didn't put your hand up yesterday, let me know, because we only had about 10 people said that they would go. Zrozumiane?
Od katedry nas przewiozą?
Tak.
Dobrze, to
tak.
musimy się gdzieś zebrać.
No, powiedzą nam gdzie, przy drzwiach frontowych, tak, już po mszy. Okay. Now, we have, uwaga, we have a pretty full meeting schedule for today. It was a fantastic day yesterday. Był bardzo wspaniały dzień. A dzisiaj dalszy ciąg, bo będziemy mieli referat. We will have a presentation from the son of the American officer, Donald Stewart, who was at Katyń, brought by the Germans to examine the exhumations when they were discovered, the Katyń victims. And he will have some very interesting revelations to share with us from the U.S. archives. So I'm really looking forward to that. And in connection with that, I just wanted to mention yesterday there was on Plac Piłsudskiego, there was a giant Polish eagle being made out of candles. And it was an event to, again, memorialize the Katyń victims. One of the things that they were doing is because the sponsor was PGNiG, the energy company, and they actually had some films to distribute. This is the English film, The Last Witness, Katyń, The Last Witness, Polish subtitles, or a Polish version. Jeżeli ktoś by chciał egzemplarz takiego filmu, to Maciej, mamy trzech? Maciej has brought 3, and I will give these to Maciej, and if you could see him afterwards, I'm sure we could probably arrange to get a few extras if we need, but we have 3 to distribute. Okay, Roma has put her hand up that she would like one. Okay, and Jan Skrybant. Any third one? Oh! Stanisław, okay. Now, how are we doing for time? I have 5 minutes. Dave, before I ask you up. Now, I just wanted to draw your attention. Our last session yesterday, because we opted for the 1-hour version of the film, we lost a half hour in the program. Now, that half hour, what I wanted to do with the executives of the Kresy-Syberia Foundation was talk to you about our work and what do we do going forward. So let me just give you 4 or 5 minutes on that now. And if we have a little bit more time at the end today, let's see if we can have a bit of a discussion and you can think about that. What I wanted to do is just quickly introduce you to, because it's the 10th anniversary of launching the Kresy-Syberia Virtual Museum, I wanted to just put it on the website and just make sure that you're all aware of it. Is there anybody who is not familiar with the Kresy-Syberia Virtual Museum? Czy jest ktoś, który nie zna tego muzeum? Nobody is putting their hand up. That's good. So that means you're all aware of it. What I wanted to just tell you about it is that this museum, because the website was developed 10 years ago, the technology has changed on the internet. Many things like Flash and so on are now not supported. Much of the technology needs to be replaced. So we invested over $1 million zlotys in developing the museum and in recording testimonies and so on. Proszę o ciszę. Proszę o troszkę ciszy, bo nie mogę myśleć. Mi rozmawiać. Dziękuję bardzo. So we've invested over $1 million zlotys and thousands of hours, even more importantly, of volunteer time in making this museum available, gathering the testimonies and opening it up to people. And it's not a one-time job because there's always new material, there's questions, people are coming. So it's an ongoing enterprise. After 10 years, we need to renew this or decide what are we going to do with it. The people who started it, many have moved on, many are tired. We need to think about how do we keep this going for the next generations. Do we give it to the Polish government? Do we give it to the Związek Sybiraków? Well, they've got the same problem. How do they pass this on now that their term is coming to an end? I'd like you to think about that, and if we have time for a little discussion at the end, that would be very valuable to us. We have 4 or 5 members of our executive of the foundation with us at the conference. We have Marcin Kavala. Marcin, please just stand and wave so people can come talk to you. We have Stanisław Urban, who is here, who is one of our executives. And we have Ivona and Marek Krasoń, who are at the door, I think, usually taking care of the table. And then, of course, we have Maciej Czarkowski, who's on our organizing committee, our Warsaw representative, if you'd like. So speak to any of us. It keeps me up at night thinking about how do we pass it on. I think I will close. I've got maybe 1 minute. I'd like to just show one thing. I had it on the screen yesterday. I'm just going to see if I can recover it today. Because I wanted to explain to you, excuse me, I wanted to explain to you why it's a little bit of an emotional thing. So let's see if this will work this morning. Zezwalaj flash. You see the technology is a bit slow, but it's coming. Okay. I think that will work. So
My father wanted.
one of the things that we have in the museum is over 1,000 interviews with survivors, with Sybiracy, in Polish, in English, some in Russian. One of them, I was very honored, was my father, and I just wanted to put him up on the screen. So he was 8 years old when he was deported, and he never spoke about Siberia. But 10 years ago, when we started this, he agreed to be interviewed, not by me, because I'm in the family, but he talked to somebody else and recorded his interview, and he died 7 years ago. But now we have his memory, and that's what we want to do for all of you. To pass on the memories. I think I'll probably finish now. Ask Dave to come up. I tried yesterday with the beard, and it's gone.
Just a few words before Dave starts. Antoni, Stefan, if you could please stay on the stage. I mam pytanie, czy pani Renata Chrzan jest z nami? Nie, dobrze.
Kłaniam się, witam wszystkich. Ja w imieniu Sybiraków z Rzepina i w imieniu swoim chciałem dla pana Stefana podziękować serdecznie za zaproszenie, za piękną konferencję, bo dzisiaj musimy około godziny 15 wyjechać. Panie Stefanie, jest pan wielki, dziękuję. I dla pana mamy taki medal z okazji 90. rocznica tutaj powstania Związku Sybiraków.
Bardzo panom dziękuję i jestem bardzo wdzięczny, że z Rzepina przyjechali Sybiracy. Mam nadzieję, że będziemy w kontakcie na Facebooku w grupie. Dobra, dziękuję bardzo panie Antoni, dziękuję. So just for those who didn't get that, this is the 90th anniversary of the Siberian Association, Związek Sybiraków. And the medal, that was from 1928 to 2018. So it's a great honor to receive that. Dziękuję bardzo.
I ponowne pytanie, czy pani Renata Chrzan jest z nami? Nie. Okej, to oddaję.
Może będzie jeszcze. So what I'd like to do now is introduce Dave Stewart to talk about some insights from his work. And he, as I spoke about my father, he's following in the footsteps of his father, Donald Stewart, who was one of the officers who was, as I mentioned, at the Katyń exhumation by the Germans in 1942 or 43. So I'm very excited, Dave, that you're here, and thank you for coming. And can I ask you to come up on stage? And we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you. David Stewart. Do you need that started?
All right, so I speak with what's called the Texas twang, not to be confused with a southern drawl. And you may need to adjust your translators. My father graduated from West Point in 1940. it was looking like it was going on a war footing. They were collecting, they started the draft, they were building the army, getting ready to go. They didn't think that they were going to be going to war with Japan, but that was a trigger. So my father graduated from the United States Military Academy, which we call West Point, in 1940, and served in the horse-drawn 17th Field Artillery until 1942, when his artillery battery was mechanized right before it was deployed to North Africa. He hated horses, by the way. He loved his Studebaker trucks. So what I did was, I've had a lot of contact with the Museum Katyński, and I brought him a bunch of the archives from my family. And Director Fracek made a comment that, you know, he had thought that most of the research had been done into Katyń until he realized that nothing had been done in the United States. So I went back and looking for documents, and I started every time I came over to Poland. This is my 9th trip. I'd bring more documents back. And then they asked me to write a book, so I did some online research and downloaded 1,200 documents from the U.S. National Archives. When I was doing the online research, I realized that there were 500 or 600 documents that had never been scanned. So I made a trip to Washington, D.C., where I did scan these. So I have a total of about 1,800 recently declassified U.S. Diplomatic and military documents. And what I've done is pull out the documents that are related to the Kresy-Syberia part of the story. Basically, what you're going to see here is we have a combination of 3 different groups of Americans. And whether it be the diplomatic corps, the press, or the military. And you have a group which is a combination of communist and pro-communist. Pro-communist being defined as let's support Russia because if they kill Russians, they're not killing Americans and more Germans die. So it was more of a practical saving American lives, whereas we really did have some communists in the American government, particularly on the press side, which we'll see later on. Then you had the other group, which was let's do the right thing. They were pro-democracy, pro-Polish. And these 2 groups basically sparred, but the biggest group was in the middle. If you were to ask them where Pearl Harbor was, they couldn't tell you. If you asked them where Warsaw was, they might know. But did they have the capabilities of determining whether it was the Germans or the Nazis? No, they were just taking the data and hoping that it would sort itself out. And that was the majority of the people, whether they be in one of those 3 services or a regular American. So the first thing that I found was a aide memoir that Lieutenant General Wasilewski-Sikorski, and I read Polish better than I speak it, so I'm going to blow a bunch of the accents. Wrote on 24 June 1941 about 200,000 missing Polish officers and an unknown number of missing Polish civilians. Sikorski discussed utilizing the large number interned and deported Poles in the Soviet Union in the war effort against Germany. This is as early as he did it. And suggested forming a Polish army under Polish command on Soviet territory and named 9 Polish officers interned by the Soviets to lead the proposed Polish army. Not all 9 were still alive. Some were, maybe a third. So this is the first document that shows that something was getting back to the U.S. So the aide memoir by Joseph Zabsky concerning the missing Polish prisoners of war. This is the first in-depth thing that was put together by the Polish government in exile, as far as I know. So Captain Joseph Zapski wrote an aid memoir about the missing Polish POWs while he was in Moscow on 29 June 42. Zapski was an ardent pacifist and had been assigned the task of locating the missing Polish POWs. In the aid memoir, Zapski mentions that only 400 to 500 Polish POWs returned home from Starobelisk, Kozelisk, and Ostrowkow, and gave a history of the liquidation of Starobelisk, where he had been interned. And the phrase liquidation here means that they shut the camp down. He does talk about, during his stay there, that it was in this memoir, which I believe that you guys have, most of you have probably seen, he talks about that daily 4 or 5 Polish officers were taken out, never to be seen again, and he uses that as an example or part of his proof to prove that the Soviets were responsible for Katyn. This report surfaces later. Right now, this is just internal within the Polish government in exile. Zapski listed the number of Polish POW officers that were in the 3 POW camps when the POW camps were liquidated by the Soviets, and determined that 8,300 Polish officers were missing. And he throws some of the names out there, but he actually does an accounting in the middle one, which, again, this shows up later. So the U.S. is still pre-Pearl Harbor, and no, we're post-Pearl Harbor, I'm sorry, because we're in 42. The 8th Air Force is being sent over to Great Britain so that it can start bombing Germany. In 1942, U.S. Army Major General Carl Spaatz was sent to London to make arrangements for the upcoming U.S. Army 8th Air Force deployment to England. Spaatz met with Brigadier General Norman Crockett, chief of Britain's prisoner of war branch, who introduced Spaatz to a secret British unit known as Military Intelligence Unit 9, MI9, which aided captured British personnel with supplies for escape attempts. Spaatz returned to Washington, D.C. with the British Air Vice Marshal Charles Medhurst in March of 42, and met with the Chief of Staff of General George C. Marshall and Secretary of War Henry L. Stinson. Stinson originally resisted the creation of MISX, but eventually supported the top secret military intelligence department. Lieutenant Colonel Rob Lee Winfrey was assigned the task of creating MISX. One of his first jobs was to recruit and train U.S. registered code users from U.S. Army personnel that were being deployed to North Africa, as they might be captured and would be invaluable in establishing the MIS network in Europe. One of the missions of MISX was to obtain, by means of codes from prisoners of war still in captivity, information concerning the locations of prisoners, conditions of imprisonment, opportunities for escape, reasons for failures and attempts to escape, and other pertinent intelligence. And Katyn fell under the other pertinent intelligence category. In a strange twist of fate, the 2 American prisoners of war, POW officers, that the Nazis selected to send to the 1943 International Katyn Commission investigation, my father, Captain Stewart, and Lieutenant Colonel John H. Van Vliet, Jr., were both registered code users, MIS registered code users. If the Nazis wanted to send somebody that was going to send the word back to the United States, they hit the jackpot by accident. On 17 March of 42, Major John G. Ondrich, the U.S. military attaché for the American legation in Tehran, Iran, forwarded a memorandum from the Polish legation in Tehran to the Assistant Chief of Staff G2, War Department in Washington, D.C. The The Polish memorandum was written in the Soviet Union on 8 March 1942 and was based upon the Captain Savaski's 20 January 1942 aide memoir. So you're seeing by the March of 1942 that Washington was aware that there were missing Polish officers. So a note from Eleanor Roosevelt to Sumner Welles enclosing letters from individuals, including Helena Sikorska, regarding welfare and whereabouts of Polish officers. In June 1942, Helen Sikorska received letters from 5 wives of Polish officers captured by the Soviets in 1939. In the letters, the wives revealed that they had not received any communication from their captured husbands and brothers since 1940. The first letter was written by Christina Glinska, sister-in-law of Lieutenant Kazimierz Glinski. So I believe these letters were requested, and there's 5 of them. On 22 June, Helena Dabrowska wrote Madam Sikorska about the possibility that her missing husband, Major Jan Dabrowski, had been sent to an Arctic island by the Soviets to work in a mine. So you can see the misinformation is already getting out here. Stanislawa Proknorova sent, okay, I told you, you need a translator. Sent Madam Sikorska a letter on 22 June 1942, mentioned the possibility that her husband, Major Josef Prochner, and her brother, Second Lieutenant Tadeusz Sawinski, may have been moved from the Starobelisk POW camp to an Arctic island, and requested that Madam Sikorska's help for locating her missing family members. The 4th letter to Madam Sikorska was written by A.M. Dulska, who mentioned that she felt that the Polish-Soviet agreement should have resulted in the release of her husband, Colonel Zadislaw, okay, ZD, okay, from the Starobelisk POW camp, and asked that Madam Sikorska for any information that she might have concerning the missing Polish officers. So now that you see that some were released, they were looking for the other ones that weren't. Sofia Sarnokowska wrote the 5th letter to Madam Sikorska on 23 June 42. Sarnowska detailed her troubles locating her husband, Captain Stefan Sarkowski, after he was captured by the Soviets, and told her of her hopes that he would reappear when the Polish armed forces in the east were formed, but that he did not. So on 8 July of 42, Madam Sikorska used her position as the vice president of the Polish Red Cross in London to forward the Polish officers' letters to Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, and asked Mrs. Roosevelt to help locate the missing Polish officers being held by the Soviets. So now you have your first official communication with the U.S. government asking for help locating the Polish officers. The U.S. ambassador in London to the Polish government in exile, A.J. Drexel Biddle Jr., who received and processed Madam Sikorska's letter, forwarded the Sikorska letter to Mrs. Roosevelt on 27 July 42. Mrs. Roosevelt contacted the U.S. Undersecretary Sumner Welles on 7 August 1942, asking if she should send the letters to the Red Cross, or was Welles going to send the letters to the American ambassador to the USSR, Admiral William Stanley. Welles forwarded the Sikorska letters to Stanley on 13 August 1942. And one thing I'd like to point out about these documents, you can start to see how many different agencies are handling these documents. This is probably blown up a little too big, but this is a note size. We have blue paper, we have wide white paper, we have skinny white paper. Each agency seemed to have its own letter size and colors, so those will be changing as we go through this. Okay, where would we? gotta go back. It's not gonna let me.
The second one, second one down.
To go back?
Yeah. When you have that menu, just click on the second line. Click down. Poprzedni. That's it. That goes back one. Yeah.
Okay. So from the time they started, our Madam Sikorska decided to start collecting the letters was, in April. And by the middle of August, these have been delivered to the Soviet ambassador in August, which is not a very long time. And then the issue just sort of disappears. I'm not sure if that's what Madam Sikorska wanted done, but it, the pure Soviet thing is they're lost and they'll be found. Okay, so we now have the U.S. registered code users strung out through the American combat forces that are fixing to fight the Germans in North Africa. About 2/3 of them were American officers and about 1/3 were enlisted men. From the records that I saw a couple of months ago, there were about 9,800 U.S. registered code users, and about 4,600 of them were captured. What happened to the other 5,000? Either they were killed in battle, wounded, and returned to the U.S., or they were never captured. But we did have 4,600 active people sending code messages back. So we'll go through this first. Major General Lloyd Fredenal was the commander of the U.S. Second Corps in Tunisia during 1943. Fredenal was an incompetent military leader who rarely left the sanctuary as a command post miles behind the fighting front and refused to listen to scouting reports of his reconnaissance units, choosing instead to plan his battles from inaccurate and outdated maps. Because of Fredenal's gross incompetence, several U.S. Army units were destroyed during the Battle of Kasserine Pass during February 1943, including Captain Stewart's 17th Field Artillery and Lieutenant Colonel John Van Vliet Jr.'s 3rd Battalion of the 168th Infantry. My father hated Fredenal because he placed the 17th Field Artillery in a vulnerable position, which not only resulted in its destruction as an effective combat unit, but also resulted in the death or capture of 2/3 of the 95 men in his command. My father told me that a unit was wiped out so fast during the battle that he shot more rounds destroying his U.S. Army trucks and artillery pieces than he did at the enemy. The 17th Field Artillery was later reformed and fought with distinction in the Italian campaign. Lieutenant Colonel Van Vliet Jr.'s 3rd of the 168th Infantry Battalion was surrounded by superior German tank units, and all but 24 soldiers who managed to escape back to U.S. lines were captured. So in this one battle that lasted about 5 days, 6 of the MISX code users, including the grandson of General George S. Patton, Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, were all started to head towards Oflag 64. They put 6 code users together and they immediately set up a network. Okay, this is a draft of a conversation with Colonel Onasiewicz, Polish attaché at a luncheon, 14 April 1943. This is right after the announcement of the discovery of the graves. This is actually a memo, and it's unsigned, which either tells me there's a page 3 that's long since disappeared or something. Well, it does say draft. It's a draft. So that this isn't a signed copy. I couldn't find the signed copy. An unknown U.S. government employee prepared a draft for a memorandum of conversation about the discussion that he had with military attaché Colonel Onasivitz at a luncheon on 14 April 1943. The colonel provided a transcript of a Berlin radio broadcast about Katyń, which he believed to be true, and stated that the U.S. Office of Wartime Information, otherwise known as the OWI, was communistic and obstructive to Polish propaganda, and mentioned that the British and American policy of appeasement with the Soviet Union was harmful to the future of Europe. And this is in April of 1943. The Office of Wartime Information will come back again. This is the first person to call them communistic. The colonel concluded that his discussion by talking about the future of Poland after World War II ended. He believed that an undefended Ukraine would be essential to the defense of Poland in post-World War II, that if the Soviets occupied the Ukraine, then it would be necessary for Poland to retake the region, and that the American presence in the territory would be welcome because there was a general dislike of England throughout Europe. This is London Telegram number 16 from John Winnett regarding the discovery of the graves of Polish officers. U.S. Ambassador to the United Kingdom's John Winnett sent telegram number 16 to the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, which reported that General Sikorski was concerned about the growing animosity that the Polish armed forces felt towards the Soviets because of Moscow's insistence on using the Ribbentrop, that one didn't go right, Moscow line to determine the post-World War II border between the USSR and Poland. The denial of citizenship to Poles deported to the USSR, we'll get back on that one later too. And the recent German claims about the Katyń massacre merited an investigation of the graves by a proper international body such as the International Red Cross. So this is the first time that General Sikorski's request for the Katyń investigation was officially sent to the U.S. Memorandum. Hello? There we go. Massacre of 10,000 Polish officers. U.S. Department of State Chief of European Affairs Ray Atherton received an internal State Department memorandum about the alleged Soviet massacre of 10,000 Polish officers on 17 April 1943, which mentioned that both the German and Polish governments had asked for the International Red Cross to conduct an investigation at the gravesite, and that the Polish government in exile had asked the State Department in 1942 to have the U.S. Embassy in Moscow Naval Attaché Admiral William H. Stanley asked Soviet officials about the whereabouts of the missing Polish officers, and that the only Soviet response to the Polish government inquiries to date was that the Polish officers had been sent to eastern Siberia and might have escaped into Manchuria. Okay, I wonder where the documents went. Report on alleged killing of 10,000 Polish officers by Russian in Smolensk area, OWI radio treatment. On 19 April 1943, the U.S. Office of Wartime Information, OWI, decided that no further use was to be made of the Polish atrocity story, and Mr. Snyder of the OWI issued a memorandum directing his staff to act accordingly. Annex 1 special guidance of the Snyder Memorandum proposed that the purpose of the German reports was to cause a rift in Polish-Soviet relations. Annex 2 of the Snyder Memorandum provided advice on how to implement the special guidance mentioned in Annex 1. The documents are missing. These documents fell out somehow. We're going back, right? Okay, so Annex 3 of the Snyder Memorandum referred to a recent Elmore Davis radio broadcast about Katyń and declared that the Soviet involvement in the massacre to be a German fabrication. Annex 4 of the Snyder Memorandum instructed all desks to drop further use of statements by United States senators concerning the Polish officers, and he put in quotations, atrocity story. So basically what the OIW has done here is they are quashing any more mention of the Katyń massacre in American press. This unit was definitely communistic. All right, so this is incoming message number 46 from Cairo to the War in Military Intelligence Division, MILD, concerning the announcement that the German radio about Polish officers found in a mass grave near Smolensk. This should actually have a copy. This thing corrupted. So what they started capturing Radio Berlin things, and then they would translate them, and they were sending if the radio broadcast was made on Tuesday, by Wednesday at noon, that radio broadcast was sent back to military intelligence. So they were getting the information within 24 hours, so they knew what the Germans were saying. On 24 April 1943, the State Department received a translation of a Radio Berlin broadcast on 22 April 43, which the Germans reported that the Polish Army High Command had shifted the Polish Army to the southern part of Iran with the permission of British military authorities because of the news reports from Katyń. A translated 23 April 1943 radio broadcast stated that the German massacre was a prelude to what would happen to the world if the Soviets won World War II. So these predictions of areas to be concerned about were already headed back to military intelligence and the diplomats. You know, I've got my stick here. If we could play it off the stick. These documents are corrupted.
Może by pan pomóc?
I mean, how do you get, can I see if there's any documents left?
Może z pendrive'a.
Can you, yeah, I'll get the flag. Can you drop it to where we can, is this going to keep happening?
Do you have your USB stick?
Yeah, I do. I don't understand how it's corrupted. So the documents, the little radio broadcasts, I told you everything has a different look. They're on a brown paper, and they're like a teletype that you would rip off like this. So they're only about this big. So, and looking at the documents is really one of the bigger joys I had of working with them. They're all just so different. Okay, and message to President Roosevelt from Winston Churchill. In message number 284, Prime Minister Winston Churchill sent President Franklin Delano Roosevelt a copy of a telegram that he sent Premier Joseph Stalin on 25 April 1943. in which Churchill offered to intercede with General Sierkowski in order to prevent a Katyn investigation, asked Stalin to allow more Poles and their dependents to go to Persia as a bargaining chip to help pacify the Polish army in Persia, and requested that the Soviet government maintain diplomatic relations with the Polish government. So this is some of the behind-the-scenes play that Churchill was doing. Okay, these actually are faded documents. London telegram number 24 from John Winnett regarding missing Polish officers near Smolensk, and he's the American ambassador. Winnett reported in telegram number 24 on 27 April 1943 that during a meeting with Sikorsky earlier in the day, Sikorsky had been informed that Romer now believed that the Soviet note read to him by Molotov on 24 April 1943 used the word suspend instead of severe relations, or no, severe, when it discussed the future of Polish-Soviet relations, and Romer still believed that further Polish-Soviet discussions might be possible. Sikorsky informed Churchill that he was willing to soft pedal the Polish press in exchange for the release of certain Poles from the USSR. Sikorsky stated that while he was uncertain what was behind the Soviet move, he was sure that the Soviets would leverage the current situation to their advantage, and that the Soviets broke off relations with the Poles in order to divert attention from Smolensk. So this is the ambassador sending information back to Washington, D.C. Telegram number 1366 from Herschel V. Johnson to the Secretary of State regarding the Smolensk mass murders and the break in diplomatic relations between Moscow and the London press. This comes out like just a couple of days after they're saying there's still hope. Herschel V. Johnson, a U.S. Department of State employee stationed in Stockholm, Sweden, sent telegram number 1366 to the Secretary of State on 27 April 1943. Johnson reported on a long conversation that he had with the Polish military and naval attachés from the Polish embassy in Stockholm. The Polish attachés considered the Smolensk reports to be propaganda until proven otherwise, that the Polish-Soviet diplomatic break was a victory for Goebbels, and believed that the Soviets did not trust Sikorsky because he discouraged the Polish nation when the propaganda broadcast on the Soviet radio station Okosiewsko called on the Poles in German-occupied Poland to revoke. So this is one of the few documents that I ran in where actual Poles were believing the Russians over the Germans. And that's probably why they were in Stockholm. Incoming message number 746 from the Lisbon to the Military Intelligence Division, which is MILID, containing documents on the rupture of Soviet-Polish diplomatic relations. Secret incoming message number 746 sent by Solberg from Lisbon, Portugal on 27 April 1943 reported that local officials with the Strong Army, which I believe is referring to General Beasley Strong, who was behind arming Andre's army, and diplomats were concerned about the diplomatic break between the Soviet government and the Polish government in exile. They believed that the Soviet actions indicated a Soviet disregard for Anglo interest and predicted an ominous fate for Poland after World War II, and indicated that the Polish Communist government was ready to assume control of Poland. Solberg's personal evaluation was that the Soviet-Polish diplomatic break benefited the Germans and weakened the Soviet claims that the Germans murdered the Polish officers found near Smolensk. So now you have another independent American diplomat overseas sending a report back that favors a German report. Copy of the note from the U.S. President to Mr. Joseph Stalin regarding the break of diplomatic relations between the Soviet Union and Poland. On 30 April 1943, Roosevelt asked Stalin to define the Polish-Soviet diplomatic relations break as a suspension rather than a complete severance of relations, stated that he did not believe that Sikorsky had collaborated with the Hitlerite gangsters, but that Sikorsky had made a mistake when requesting the International Red Cross investigation, asked Stalin to help send more Poles out of the Soviet Union, and mentioned that while several million Poles living in the U.S. were anti-Hitlerite, a severance of Polish-Soviet diplomatic relations might affect their opinions. So somebody finally got something right as far as the changing of the attitudes. The International Katyń Commission, Part 1. The Germans, with Polish support, requested that the International Red Cross investigate the Katyń Massacre, and the International Katyń Commission was formed in 1943. The Germans staffed the International Katyń Commission with 12 forensic experts in their staffs. The commission members came from Belgium, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Denmark, Finland, France, Italy, Holland, Hungary, Romania, and Switzerland. Switzerland was the only country that was not either Nazi-occupied or allies of the Nazis, which is common knowledge. In order to add further legitimacy to the Katyń Commission, the Germans decided to include Allied prisoners of war, POWs, as witnesses to the Katyń exhumations. The selected Allied officers consisted of 2 British officers, 2 American officers, 3 British enlisted men, and a British civilian. Originally, there were 2 additional enlisted men, but because none of the selected POWs would promise not to escape, otherwise give their parole, promising not to escape, they removed 2 of the witnesses and replaced them with 2 German guards. While it can't be proved absolutely, we believe that one of the British sergeants was actually a German spy, and everybody avoided him because he didn't know where a pub was in London, something like that. 3 of the Allied officers came from Offislager IXAZ, a POW camp in Rottenburg an der Fulda, Germany, which was a subcamp of Oflag IXAH. Oflag IXZ was located at the site of the former Jacob Grimm School for Machen. The 4th Allied officer came from the Lazarette B POW camp at the former Rottmünster Abbey located in Rottweil on Nectar, Germany. The 3 British enlisted men and British civilian internee came from various stalags in Germany. So this is a combination of 2 things here. Before they would go, the Allies said, or the 3 officers, my father and Lieutenant Colonel Van Vliet and Lieutenant Colonel Stevens, refused to go to Katyń without written orders. So on 30 April 1943, the senior British officer in Oflag IXAZ, Brigadier General Claude Nicholson, acknowledged a verbal order from Camp Security Officer Hauptmann Heil and requested written travel orders before the POWs. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Stevenson of the British Dominions, Lieutenant Colonel Van Vliet, and Captain Stewart were to proceed for Katyń, and sent a written protest letter to the Protective Power Swiss Legation in Berlin. On 9 May 1943, the German Adjutant Commander Major D. Bormann issued the written travel orders to Katyń for Stevenson, Van Vliet, and Stewart. So this is a copy of the request for the written orders. The middle one is a copy of the protest sent to the protective powers. And what is the last one? The last one should be a certificate that they went under orders and under duress they did not volunteer to go. So now the report sent to the Swiss legation was not processed for 13 months. This letter was written in April of 1943. It was forwarded in July of 44 to the U.S. government. It sat in Switzerland for 13 months. Letter to Franklin Roosevelt from Summer Wells. Churchill sent a telegram to Roosevelt on 28 April 43 that revealed the efforts of the British government to shift the focus of the Polish government in exile from the dead to the living and from the past to the future. Mentioned cautious support for the future relocation of Poles living in the USSR to Persia and gaining control of the Polish press regarding future Smolensk massacre press releases. So at this time, they're still trying to bargain with Stalin. Report number 5306, digest report titled Brazilian Reaction to Russian-Polish Severance of Relations. And this one is really interesting because it comes from South America. U.S. Major Lloyd H. Gomes sent digest report number 5306 on 7 May 1943, which reported that while the Brazilian local press favored the Poles, there was concern that the Smolensk events could be detrimental to the unity of the United Nations, and local Poles believed that the International Red Cross investigation would discover atrocities committed by both the Germans and the Soviets that could be used as bargaining points by Poland at the peace tables in post-World War II. Some of the younger Poles theorized that the Soviets had very cleverly turned the Smolensk events to their political advantage by using the Katyń Forest massacre as an excuse to break off diplomatic relations with the Polish government in exile and in London, which then offered the Soviets a chance to create a red Polish government in exile in Moscow. So this is a first outside prediction of the Lublin government forming. So the International Katyń Commission, Part 2. The protest filed on 30 April 43 by Brigadier General Nicholson and Lieutenant Colonel Van Vliet Jr. objecting to Hopman-Hiles' verbal order sending Stevenson, Van Vliet, and Stewart to Katyń for the International Katyń Commission's investigation were rejected. Stewart was chosen as a replacement for senior Army officer Colonel Thomas D. Drake, who refused to travel to Katyń. These documents here are actually out of the Madden Committee, and it discusses how the officers were chosen. Basically, Colonel Drake, he was a very inflexible military officer. He had very high standards. He was a pain in the side for the German Kampfkommandant and was critical to the discipline at Oflag 64. But he so firmly believed that it was propaganda that he refused to have anything to do with it. He'll show up again a little later because he refuses to take a coded message back to the U.S. I once found the pair of boots that my father wore in the Katyń Forest. They were very worn but still serviceable. I asked my father what it was like, and he told me that the smell was terrible, so he chain smoked a carton of cigarettes that day. He said that although somebody in their group always had a cigarette lit, it really didn't help much. A letter with enclosures from Jan Sikanowski to Lloyd W. Henderson regarding, well, this is an earlier version, Polish officers, prison camps. On 25 May 1943, the Polish ambassador sent Lloyd W. Henderson, Assistant Chief of the U.S. Department of State, Division of European Affairs, copies of an 18 March 1943 that the Polish Red Cross sent to the International Red Cross of Geneva. The Polish Red Cross correspondence gave a history of his communications with the POWs interred at the 3 POW camps in a new POW camp at Gryzowiec, and documented the failure of the Polish Red Cross to contact any of the missing officers during August, September, and October 1940. So this is also in the hands of the U.S. government. Outgoing message number 1095 from Military Intelligence Service to Military Attaché Cairo, indicating General Strong's interest in a German report only if German complicity is shown. Lieutenant Colonel Henry L. Szymanski, the U.S. military attaché to Cairo, Egypt, sent message number 113 about the Katyń Massacre to U.S. Military Intelligence Service in Washington, D.C. in late 1943. The Deputy Chief of Staff for Military Intelligence Service, Major George Beasley Strong, hence the Strong Army reference before, responded to the Szymanski message on 28 May 1943 with outgoing message number 1095. And it goes like this. Cairo message number 113 received garble. For Szymanski, if you mean Katyń affair, I'm only interested if report shows German complicity. So you have the head of U.S. military intelligence who no longer has an open mind, who firmly believes that the Germans did it. Message from the military mission, Middle East, number 127 from Cairo, indicating that the Katyń affair report is completed and shows no German complicity. So the American Lieutenant Colonel Szymanski sent Major General Strong, he didn't sign it, an unsigned message number 127 on 30 May 1943, announcing the forwarding of a translated report that indicated no German complicity in the Katyń affair. And that closed out this communication chain. He was told only to forward a report if it showed German complicity, and this guy bucked him. I really like this guy. He's got a lot of principles. He also was one of the last people to testify before the Madden Committee. He's the first U.S. officer that was not captured that figured out what happened at Katyń, and his original report was ignored, and then he winds up having one of the major testimonies at the Madden Committee. I believe it's in Book 7. Memorandum enclosing a copy of Special Report number 273 discussing Polish-Russian relations. On 11 June 1943, Elbridge Dubrow forwarded OSS Special Report number 273, written on 28 May 1943, with the comment that the OSS Special Report number 273, okay, yeah, it's the same report, that report did not set forth a true picture of the facts as known to the EU, and we're still trying to figure out what EU means. So whoever got that report. And according to the Department of State reports, the last paragraph on page 1 was in error because the Soviet authorities had failed to give adequate food and arms to rehabilitate the newly recruited members of the Polish army, that the Poles in the Soviet Union did not go there to flee capture by the Germans, and that the Western companies did not define espionage in the same way that the Soviets did. But the key one here is that the Soviets were putting out that the Poles fled the Germans, and now they have a report coming back that contradicts it. Code letters sent by U.S. registered code users to MISX. Unbeknownst to the Germans, the two American officers that the Germans selected to be witnesses for the Katyń farce investigation, Van Vliet Jr. and Stewart, had been trained by MISX to be U.S. registered code users. Stewart arrived at Oflock 64 on 6 June 1943, and Van Vliet Jr. arrived at Oflock 64 on 23 June 1943. At the request of the Secretary of the Army, Stewart made the following classified statement on 10 September 1950, which indicated that the first reports about the Soviet involvement in the Katyń massacre were sent from Oflock 64 to MISX in July of 1943. So 3 months after they had made the trip and come back, the first code letters were sent back to military intelligence. I found other documents that indicates that Roosevelt had received the translated coded reports in the middle of August of 1943, and that he said, I don't believe them. And it's probably because the officers were POWs. I don't know. Carter John, John Carter was a freelance, independently wealthy advisor to President Roosevelt. I'm not sure exactly where his income came from, but he wrote reports on just shipping, arms manufacturing, and he got involved into the Office of Wartime Information. This is another American who got it right from the start. John F. Carter wrote a blistering report on 28 July 1943 about the competency of the Office of Wartime Information Office in New York City. New York City newspaper reporters had complained to Carter that the OWI staff were uncooperative, incompetent, communists, psychopaths, drunks, bums, and radicals. That was the nice things they said. Carter revealed that OWI Director Sherwood was refusing to give OSS Director William Joseph Donovan the daily OWI propaganda directives and recommended that the Department of State should assume control of the political aspects of the overseas propaganda and psychological warfare program. So now we have a turf war going on between the group on the right and the far left group. Military Attaché Report 11550 regarding the Polish officers in the USSR, and I hope that doesn't mean we're losing documents again. On October 9, 1943, Lieutenant Edward L. Barlow sent Military Attaché Report number 11550 written by A.P. Coleman to the Military Intelligence Division in New York City. Coleman documented an interview with a former Polish Army Second Lieutenant Marion, and I forgot his name, misspelled, Kerman, who described his war experiences and living conditions in the Soviet POW camps in which he was interned after he was captured by the Soviets. It might be on the next page. Well, let me finish this and then we'll see, unless you want to check it. No, they should be there. There should be 4 of them.
Dave,
Yeah.
maybe the Office of War Intelligence got hold of your files.
Yeah. Yeah. They're resurrected.
To komuniści pijacy.
No.
Okay, I've done that one. So if we could start, if it'll load from 43 on, we're good. Yeah, 43 is good. Yeah, we're getting close. Yeah, I can do it in 15. I'll push. Okay. Corman stated that he believed that the Soviets killed the Polish officers in the Katyn forest because he knew that the Soviets murdered many policemen and lawyers during the first days of the Soviet occupation of Poland, and that many Polish officers disappeared daily from the key POW camp where he was at, never to be seen again. On 8 December 1943, Lieutenant Colonel Szymanski, U.S. military attaché to Cairo, Egypt, sent the War Department G2 Assistant Chief of Staff a request to conduct, and this being quotes, to conduct military intelligence against the Soviets, including military intelligence, economic affairs, communications, internal policies, and foreign policy. Szymanski wanted to place the Central Bureau in Palestine with the two supporting branches in Turkey and Iran. Szymanski requested a monthly budget of $10,000, that's a lot of money back then, proposed using Poles for the field agents, and recommended joint Polish-American control of the intelligence operation. The Szymanski report was immediately classified secret, and additional security declaration was attached to reports which warned recipients that this document contains information affecting the national defense of the United States within the meaning of the espionage laws, Title 18, USC, Section 7903 and 794. The transmission or revelation of its contents in any manner to any unauthorized person is prohibited by law. This one stamp right there is only on this document. They buried Szymanski's report so deep that nobody could see it. This probably was not seen by more than a dozen people. And he continues, after he's told not to butt heads with Washington, D.C. Like I said, this guy's one of my heroes. Nearly a year after a protest letter signed by Brigadier General Nicholson and Lieutenant Colonel Van Vliet and Stewart about the proposed trip of the OFLOG IXAZ POW officers of Smolensk was sent to the Swiss legation in Berlin, George Tate, first Secretary for the American legation in Bern, sent the Secretary of State Dispatch 8064, which included a translation of the 27 April 44 note from the Swiss office, which means that on 27 April, the Swiss finally responded to the "Don't Let Me Go" letter. In Bern, that mentioned Van Vliet Jr. and Stewart were interviewed at OFLOG 64 by Swiss inspectors on 18 March 1944, and that the attached documents were uncensored. So in March, they did a field report, but they waited until later in April before the reports returned to the U.S. So we have that, we're not under duress. That document doesn't make it back until 13 months later. So what I get a kick out of this is that they're not repairing the document here. He's covering up initials of people who signed for it. And the paper's so thin, you can see Taft's name right there. Now, not on this scale, but, you know, use black paper if you don't want me to read your name. So the American legation in Bern translated Borman's written travels orders into English and included the translated travels orders with Dispatch 8064. The certificate of true facts signed by Stewart and Van Vliet on 24 March 1944 described their treatment during their trip to and from the forest, which this is the document that Washington, D.C. was waiting for. So on 30 June 44, Carter forwarded 5 intelligence reports. The first intelligence report gave a history of the Soviet-Polish relations, revealed that the Polish army left the Soviet Union because the Soviet military could not further arm the Polish army, and that Director Nafokova of the Narko Mendel saw no need for a Polish embassy in the Soviet Union since all Poles on Soviet territory were already considered as Soviet citizens, which contradicts the statement they made a year before. So this one here, they're now sending newspaper articles back. This one's from Sweden. And it reveals that alleged German policemen, driven mad by the horrible crime that they committed when they massacred the Poles in Katyń, had revealed that the massacre victims were really captured Jews who were forced to dress in Polish uniforms. And then all these supposedly Germans committed suicide. Convenient. Okay. Oh, okay. The OSS agent reported that while Polish exiles in Sweden did not believe the Dutch newspapers because the Polish officers had disappeared shortly after their capture by the Soviets, they had refused comment on the massacre of the investigations because it would do no good for the war effort since the murdered Poles could not be brought back to life. Looking to the immediate future, the OSS field agent warned that the Katyń Massacre could be fatal for the Soviet-Allied partnership and that the Soviet explanations of the Katyń Massacre were not convincing when the Soviet liquidation of the kulaks is considered. On 30 June 1944, Carter forwarded the 5 Polish intelligence reports along with comments that the new means of passing the future Polish intelligence to Carter needed to be established. The first Polish intelligence report provided by Carter gave a history of the Soviet-Polish relations, and we'll just skip on this. Wait a minute, that's a repeat. We already saw that one. The status of the Polish corps in the USSS, the condition of Polish refugees in Central Asia, and the resistance of the Polish government in exile to the recall of Ambassador Biddle was detailed in the first Polish intelligence report, as well as the deterioration of British-Soviet relations in Italy. The loss of U.S. prestige in Poland caused by the cancellation of Prime Minister Mikhailov's trip to Washington, D.C., and the failure of the U.S. to fulfill promised delivery of planes to the Polish underground was also mentioned. So the Polish government in exile is putting out a laundry list of problems that they're having with their allies. And the summary of the report mentioned that the U.S. and Great Britain had lost prestige in Europe because of lack of a clear-cut post-war policy, and that the Polish government did not want to come out of World War II diminished or belittled. So then the president of the Ukraine Congress Committee sent FDR a letter on 13 October 44. He responded to press reports of the 11 October 44 meeting that FDR had with the Polish American Congress. In the letter, Shimeko stated that the disputed Polish border area were of Ukrainian, not Soviet or Polish lineage, and they wanted to determine their own political future with a free election. Which is what this page says. So Roosevelt sends this letter out to his staff with, this is a one copy only, to be returned to my files. Do not make copies of it. So Roosevelt is sitting on this request. So here we have the Polish-American Democratic Organization of Chicago made a resolution calling for an independent and sovereign Poland with the restoration of Poland to its boundaries on 1 September 1939. And this also went to Roosevelt. And here we have Roosevelt being notified that the Lublin government had taken over for Poland. Okay, and here's an acknowledgement that the sole copy was returned to Roosevelt as requested. Oh, this is on 16 February 45, Dubrow forwarded a letter from the Prime Minister of the Polish government in exile to Mr. Lott at the White House, appealed not. The ambassador appealed to FDR not to make any decision which might jeopardize the legitimate rights of Poland or independence, and warned FDR that the provisional government of Lublin intended to try members of the Polish army and Polish underground as traitors. He had all this information before he went to Yalta, and he ignored my father's code letter, and he ignored all these reports. So in the post-war years, Lieutenant Colonel Van Vliet and my father testified before the Madden Committee about their trip to the Katyń Forest. My father's testimony was never classified by the U.S. Army and has remained a public record since 1952. The Van Vliet testimony was classified shortly after the Madden Committee, and thanks to Sebastian Karvat with the Museum Katyński, who located a copy of Van Vliet's Madden Committee testimony a couple of years ago, I finally had a chance to read the previously classified testimony, and I'm somewhat baffled why it took so long to get it declassified. After their Madden Committee testimonies, both Van Vliet and my father were ordered by the U.S. Army not to talk to anyone about their World War II involvement in the 1943 Red Cross investigations. The U.S. Army rescinded Van Vliet's gag order in November of '62, but for some reason did not rescind my father's gag order until mid-1968, when the Roy Towers PhD dissertation, The Case of the Missing Officers, the Katyń Forest Massacre, was filmed. Now known as the Towers Tape, the film was one of the first video PhD dissertations in the U.S., and featured interviews with both Van Vliet and my father. In 1970, on the 30th anniversary of the Katyń Massacre, my father spoke publicly about his involvement in the 1973 Red Cross Katyń investigation for the first time in 18 years when he addressed the Polish-American Congress during its annual convention in Chicago. Shortly afterwards, my father contacted the Polish embassy in Washington, D.C. and offered all of his personal Katyń paperwork and records to the Polish people. The Polish embassy responded that my father's documents did not seem to be very important to the Polish people, but the Polish government would accept the documents if my father could not find another place for them. Sensing a trap, my father secured the documents and gave orders to his family members that the documents were never to leave the U.S. because he believed that the Soviets planned to destroy them. So I wound up getting drafted for the Vietnam War, and the U.S. had been involved in Vietnam conflict for 15 years when I was drafted in the U.S. Army in '72. Approximately 48,000 American soldiers had died in Vietnam when I entered the U.S. Army. My father drove me to the U.S. induction station, and as we were leaving the house, he gave me advice about fighting in a war. Keep moving because the enemy can sight in on you, it can sight in on a stationary target. Given the choice, get shot or break a bones, those wounds healed. Above all, vacate any location where you might get burned. Those wounds never heal. And finally, never shoot an unarmed prisoner or civilian. If you do, then you will no longer be my son. And he had just gotten off his gag order, and we'd never had a conversation in depth about Katyń. So I was somewhat taken aback by this comment, as I had not yet fully comprehended the crime that the Soviets had committed in the Katyń forest in 1943. My response to my father was, "Right, Dad, who would ever do anything like that?" You know, I now stand corrected. That should be it, right? Yeah.
Dave, thank you very much for that, and I'm glad we sorted out the slides disappearing as you were going. We've come just about to the end of your time slot, but I thought if Marcin doesn't mind giving us just the grace of a few minutes before we start his presentation, yes? If there were some questions for you, because I think you've shared the tip of the iceberg of all the documents that you've kind of discovered, but I thought it would be worth getting, you know, people had some questions about that. If I could just start with one question. So what did happen with your father's papers in the end? Did they go to any other institution, or do you still have them?
We have 17 of his code letters. My sister has it at her house. A lot of the other stuff we've scanned, and I provided copies to the Museum Katyński.
Okay, so they're safe.
They're safe, yes.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Może podam najpierw do Chris. Chris, maybe you first, and then Pani, and then Marcin.
Oh, am I going to need an interpreter then?
No, I speak English.
Okay.
Do I look Polish? I don't know. Thank you. Yeah, my English not so good looking either. Thank you, David. Appreciate you taking the time to put this together. How long was your father a POW?
He was captured in February 14th, 1943, and liberated in April of 1945.
Okay, so the
The entire war for the Americans in Europe.
Very good. Thank you.
Pani miała pytanie?
Ja mam to wszystko trzeba opublikować.
She's saying you should publish this.
That's
To
in the
wszystko
works.
trzeba opublikować. You must.
I'm actually working with the Museum Katyński on getting a book published. It's 2 volumes. Volume 1 is 1939 to 1945, and Volume 2 is 1946 to present.
To będzie.
Fantastycznie. So that's the Katyń Museum. We hope it'll come out maybe next year in time for our conference.
It's supposed to come out on the 80th anniversary of the massacre.
Okay. Marcin, I'll pass this to you, and then the floor is yours for your presentation.
Thank you for your presentation. So we know that the book is coming, and for the time being, are those scanned documents available online?
This is actually a portion of my book, but some are, some aren't. I mean, I told you I had to go to Washington, D.C. to physically photocopy about 500 or 600 of the documents. If you understand how the U.S. archives work, you can find most of the rest of them, but the keywords are really screwy.
Okay, so we'll just have to wait for your book.
Yeah, I mean, the book's being written in Polish and
Okay.
American.
Cool.
So
Thank you.
I,
Thanks again, David. Thank you again. So we've got half an hour now before our lunch break, which is going to be more than adequately filled up, I think, by our world traveler and member of the Foundation's Executive Committee, Marcin Kawala. Marcin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Dziękuję. The presentation will be in Polish, so if you need a translator, now is the time to get it. I tu jest ten, super. Dam radę, super. Wiem, że są Państwo głodni, także będę się streszczał. Deportacje Polaków na Syberię od XVI do XX wieku. Wszystkim nam chyba znany jest Marsz Sybiraków, aczkolwiek tekst zaczyna się od Konfederacji Barskiej, a Polacy trafiali na Syberię trochę wcześniej. Również ze względu na limit czasu i generalną znajomość tematu wykład swój zakończę na roku 1939, czyli z pominięciem II wojny światowej i stalinizmu. Już w XVI wieku w wyniku wojen polsko-moskiewskich do niewoli rosyjskiej trafiali żołnierze, a także porywani mieszkańcy pogranicza. Około 1580 roku kozak Timofij Jermak na czele około 800 osób ruszył na wschód, na podbój. Polscy i litewscy jeńcy byli wśród jego żołnierzy. Przegrana wojna z Rzeczpospolitą obojga narodów i utrata Inflant zmusiła Iwana IV Groźnego i jego następców do zwrócenia
Fourth, the Terrible and his successors to pay attention to the lands in the east. The conquest proceeded quickly. In 1587, Tobolsk was founded, located about 950 kilometers from Perm, and in 1632, Yakutsk, 6,000 kilometers away from Perm. Mogę się przesiąść do twojego?
Wszystko na szaro zostało podbite, jak widać, między 1533 a 1689, czyli mniej więcej wszystko to zostało podbite w ciągu 100 lat.
From the beginning, Poles became an important link in the conquest and development of Siberia. Especially those who could read and write found employment in trade or administration, becoming even voivodes. There are even rumors about a Pole who was the secretary of Khan Kuchum fighting the Cossacks. A lot of Poles came to Siberia after the Dimitrios, as the new Tsar Roman Romanov wanted them away from the capital. There is news from the beginning of the 17th century about troops composed of Poles and Lithuanians. There were also those who, in the 17th century, chose Siberia, converted to Orthodoxy, and built their fortunes in the Tsar's service. It is interesting that opinions about Poles in Siberia coincide with those about Poles in Jamestown, Virginia, where they were often called the only useful colonists. In the mid-17th century, several hundred Poles were in Tsarist service and several thousand in total in Siberia. The most distinguished ones were given the title of boyar children. Let the fact of saturation of the first colonizers in Siberia with Poles be evidenced by the fact that at the end of the 17th century in Ochotsk, one of the districts was called the Polish district. Poles distinguished in the 17th century include Stefan Polakow, Nicefor Czernichowski, Krzyżanowskis, Czernyszewskis, and Kozyriewskis. I will say a few words about Nicefora Czernichowski. He was taken prisoner around 1632. It is known that he commanded a unit of Cossacks in the Yenisei and then managed the salt works. Czernichowski's sister or wife was kidnapped and raped by the Ilim voivode, for which Czernichowski took part in a rebellion against the voivode in 1655. After killing the voivode, our hero, along with a unit of Cossacks, escaped to the south. They rebuilt a stronghold in Albazin in Amur River and named their state Yaksa. It was Czernichowski's coat of arms. Yaksa's charter of rights forbade rape and pacification and provided protection. The state quickly began to develop. It even established contacts with the imperial court in Beijing, and correspondence was reportedly conducted in Polish. Soon Czernichowski also began to pay the tax to the Tsar, who forgave him all the sins. Peace treaties assumed the exchange of prisoners, so some returned to Commonwealth, the truce in Devilin from 1619, ending the Polish-Russian War in 1609-1618, ordered, among others, finding freeing Polish prisoners of war. The peace in Polanów in 1634 or the Andruszowski Treaty in 1667 decided the same. There were, of course, escapes of prisoners. The first occurred in 1620 when the group of 30 people reached Lithuania and then Poland. Many prisoners and civilians came to Siberia as a result of the Civil War. In 1704-1706, between supporters of Stanisław Leszczyński and August II, the Strong. During the Bar Confederation 1768 to 1772, called the First National Uprising, opposition senators were abducted and transported to Kaługa. They returned in 1773. In total, about 10,000 Confederates were sent deep into Russia. The amnesty published in 1773 did not include those recruited into the Tsarist army working in mines and those who converted to Orthodoxy. Irony of fate, people fighting for freedom were conscripted into a foreign army and sent to fight against the Siberian peoples and the Pugachev People's Uprising, which fought for freedom and better existence. As you can see, Dąbrowski's legionaries suppressing the anti-French uprising in Haiti were not the only ones in Polish history. Anyway, just like in Haiti, Poles in Siberia deserted and joining the natives in insurgents in fight against the Russians. Speaking of Bar Confederation, you cannot forget about probably the most famous exile, Maurycy Beniowski, Polish nobleman of Slovak-Hungarian origin. He was exiled to Kamchatka. There he hijacked the ship with his fellow prisoners, and after many adventures, he reached France and joined the French service. He was sent to Madagascar, where he was even proclaimed king by the natives. Cancelled by the King of France, landed again on the island wanting to conquer it for himself. He died in a skirmish with the French. He left behind memoirs which, however, should be treated with a grain of salt. Kościuszko insurrection. Tsarina Catherine II declared the insurrection a rebellion. Over 10,000 insurgents were conscripted into the Russian army, and again freedom fighters had to suppress the sovereignty of other nations. Only Katarzyna's successor, Paul I, released Poles. From this period, we have two very valuable descriptions of the deportation in Siberia by priest Józef Ochocki and Brigadier Józef Kopcia. Officially, Tsar Alexander's the first ukaz of 1801 ended the period of exile after the Confederation and insurrection. But the truth was that many prisoners were too valuable and were not released by the local administration, and some were so successful that they chose Siberia. About 1,000 Poles came to the east during the Napoleonic era. Some went to Omsk, where, among others, formed military orchestras, first military orchestras. After the Congress of Vienna, due to the non-compliance with its provisions by Tsar Alexander I, illegal organizations, often consisting of only a few members, began to form. These conspiracies would be smashed by the Tsarist police and their participants sent deep into Russia. An example could be associations of philomats and philarets. Many students were given 10-year sentences or even indefinite military service. In 1824, among others, Adam Mickiewicz was sentenced to exile deep into Russia as a teacher. His Crimean sonnets and the third part of Dziady come from the refer to this period, where our prophet even calls Poland Christ of the nations. Tomasz Zahn, arrested together with Mickiewicz, sent to Orenburg, conducted research in nature in Central Asia until 1837. Jan Witkiewicz, co-founder of the Black Brothers organization, was also sent to the Orenburg area. He had a talent for learning languages. He spoke 19 of them. As a Russian agent, he participated in the so-called the Great Game struggle for influence in Central Asia between Russia and Great Britain. There were several categories of exiles established in 1822. The first category, without losing the rights and property, after serving their sentence, they could settle in European part of Russia and sooner or later return to Poland. To the second category, to serve in strongholds in penal rotas. Conditions were tough, though reading and writing skills could help ease the conditions. The next one was the service in Siberian battalions for 15-20 years to serve as simple soldiers. It doesn't matter which rank they would have prior to that. And katorga, hard work. It could even be lifelong. Until 1822, the father-turned-man's stigma was passed on to children. They were also deprived of their liberty. The march took place on foot until the construction of railway lines. Sentenced to torture and swarms, they went handcuffed. They were pulled down at night. They went from stage to stage, often political prisoners along with zeks, criminal prisoners. Robberies, rapes, and murders occurred. Politicians could not, political prisoners could not conduct on the help of the convoy commander, who was overdrunk, drinking with other soldiers, and took part in the crimes described above. Staged houses were located every 40 kilometers. Sanitary conditions were at zero level. Nobody took care of the sick and the weak. Whoever died was quickly hidden along the trail. Because the convoy had to go on, it's estimated that in addition to huge confiscations of estates, about 3,000 Polish soldiers and officers were forcibly recruited into the Tsarist army, and after the fall of November uprising. In addition, about 20,000 civilians were exiled deep into Russia, often with their entire families. Between the November uprising and January uprising, the Tsarist police broke up further conspiracies. You do not have to belong to the conspiracy. An unflattering opinion about the Tsar was usually enough. Added to this are participants, Tsarist subjects of the Krakow uprising from 1846 and Greater Poland uprisings from 1848. Imprisonments of the Polish recruits were held regularly. The service lasted 25 years, so you could say goodbye to your family for good. It is estimated that within 20 years from the November uprising, 200,000 recruits have been recruited. The amnesty announced by Alexander II in 1856 freed all political prisoners, and most of those who survived returned to Poland. But the amnesty did not include forced recruits. January uprising, another failed Polish uprising, and against the paths leading to Asia filled with Polish convicts. 200,000 participants went through the ranks of the uprising. A large part of them died, either in fighting or in executions. About 40,000 were sent to Russia. National mourning was announced in Poland. Black clothes and jewelry were worn. The fall of uprising is connected with my favorite theory about why Poles wear wedding rings on the right hand. Well, apparently we used to wear them on the left. Only widows and widowers would wear them on the right hand. However, this changed after the January uprising, when the part of solidarity with mourners, people began to put rings on their right hands. It was a national mourning for the homeland. I'm not sure whether it's true, but I like this version. The Baikal uprising, the large number of insurgents in Siberia, often held together, led to the establishment of new conspiracies and planning new uprisings. And so on the night of June 24th and 25th, 1866, the Baikal uprising broke out. The plan was to break through to the Chinese border, but the insurgent forces of about 400 people failed to do so. After a series of engagements, the insurgents were defeated by units from Irkutsk. 4 uprising leaders were executed, others were flogged, and their sentences increased. From the 1870s until the outbreak of World War I, Another type of political prisoner appeared in Siberia, a revolutionary prisoner. He was no longer a representative of the nobility, but of the proletariat, which aimed to overthrow the Tsarism. Assassinations of officials and officers were widespread. In 1881, Ignacy Hrivniewicki made a successful assassination of Tsar Alexander II. In 1887, participating in the plot for the life of Alexander III, Bronisław and Józef Piłsudski were exiled to Siberia. Bronisław to the distant Sakhalin, where he became famous as a researcher of the Ain culture, and Józef to the Irkutsk district. Polish immigration to Siberia. It was mainly agrarian, but there were also employees of mines and steelworks. The first group started in 1885. In addition, the intelligentsia, engineers, doctors, teachers, easily received well-paid jobs. The trip to the Far East was associated with many privileges, tax breaks, reimbursements of travel expenses to the East, or farm allocation, or the already mentioned high salary. Many factories and bridges were built by Poles. Let's not forget that high positions were often unavailable to Poles living by the Vistula River. So that's the decision here comes the decision to emigrate. Polish colonies operated dynamically in cities such as Tomsk, Irkutsk, or Vladivostok. The Trans-Siberian East China railways were built by considerable participation of Polish engineers. The Poles in Russian services founded and expanded Harbin, located in today northeastern China, Manchuria. The Polish colony operated there very dynamically until the 1960s. The so-called Cultural Revolution removed virtually all Polish races from Harbin. But for example, items from the Polish church in Harmik are in the Polish church in Marayong in Sydney. Poles also remained in Siberia after the end of military service. We know that many of our countrymen were forced into the army, but there were also those who chose a military career themselves, often reaching high ranks. About 70,000 Poles were in the East when World War I broke out. During the war, prisoners of war from Central armies, including Poles, were sent to Siberia. It was these prisoners who formed the basis of the 5th Polish Rifle Division formed in Siberia in 1919, called the Siberian Division, created by Major Czuma, who in September of 1939 commanded the defense of Warsaw. The division was fighting hard with the Bolsheviks. After the division's surrender in January 1920, most of the soldiers and officers were sent to the hard labor camps. They returned to Poland after the Riga Treaty in 1921. However, some soldiers, about 1,000, broke through to Harbin, from where they came to Gdańsk by the sea and were the beginning of the Siberian Brigade, which under the command of Colonel Rumsza already in August 1920 began to fight with the Bolsheviks. After the end of World War I and the Polish-Bolshevik War, hundreds of thousands of Poles, military and civilians, came to Poland. I will also briefly mention the Far East Children's Rescue Committee, which was established on September the 16th, 1919. So tomorrow we are celebrating the centenary of this event. Mr. Kozłowski told us to remember such anniversaries. This common committee, with the huge help of Japanese Red Cross, took almost 1,000 Polish children, all orphans, half orphans, and children from poor families through Vladivostok, and through not only during the World War, our children were making their way to Africa, New Zealand, or other countries. Some children went to the families in the US, Australia, and Europe. In Poland, some of them found a place in the Siberian Children's Educational Center in Wejherowo. These children later founded the Youth Union of the Far East, on the basis of which in October 1939, special insurgent units were established. in which several partisan units fought in Poland. Of course, there were also Siberian children in the ranks of the Warsaw insurgents. After the Riga Treaty of 1921, about 2 million Poles remained in Russia, some of them voluntarily. These Poles were hit, among others, by the so-called Polish NKWD operation in 1937-38. 110,000 Poles were 100 Poles were 110,000 Poles were 100,000 Poles were murdered. Tens of thousands were sent mainly to Kazakhstan, but the repression began earlier. The Marchlewszczyzna was liquidated in 1835, and then Dzierżowszczyzna, Polish autonomous regions, in 1937. From a dozen to several dozen Poles were then sent to labor camps, and then came September 17th, 1939. I will mention briefly a few Poles whose fate is entwined with Siberia. Alfons Kozieł-Poklewski is called the Polish Rockefeller. In the 19th century, first as a Tsarist official and later on his own, he was responsible for deliveries to the army and transport of alcohol. Soon he monopolized everything. He was the owner of many distilleries, factories, and mines. He was also a philanthropist. He built nurseries, schools, and cafeterias. He bought Polish exiles from Tsarist officials, whom he later gave a job in his factories, and after the amnesty, he paid them a trip to Poland. Zachary Cybulski, the owner of gold mines, became president of Tomsk, and thanks to him, in 1888, a university was established there, the first one in the east of the Urals. Piotr Wysocki, the initiator of November Uprising, after his release from hard labor, founded a soap factory in Zabajkalskie. The soap bars with his initials, in addition to raising the level of personal hygiene, encouraged other exiles, and every year on November 29th, exiles met at in his home. They knew that the commander of the uprising was in Siberia. Leon Barszczewski, as an orphan from a patriotic family, first went to the Tsarist Cadet Corps and then to the army. In the 1870s, he volunteered to serve in Central Asia. In addition to discovering many deposits, exploring glaciers, and photographing Central Asia, Barszczewski became famous for the discovery of ancient Samarkand. For his merits, he was nominated of rank of general, and on the condition of turning to Orthodoxy. His reply sent by telegram was, "I do not agree to accept Orthodoxy. I'm Polish and Catholic." He was sent away from his beloved Asia for that. A great book about Barszczewski was written a few years ago by his great-grandson, Igor Strojecki, and accompanying exhibitions could be visited around the country, including at the Asia and Pacific Museum in Warsaw. When it comes to studying the culture and language of the Yakutsk, two Polish exiles from the late 19th century deserves immeasurably. I'm talking about Edward Piekarski and Wacław Sieroszewski. In addition to them, of course, there were many Polish researchers in Yakutia. We must not forget about the brother of the Marshal, Bronisław Piłsudski, who was exiled in 1887 and studied the culture of Ain in Sakhalin. He was and still is one of the most distinguished researchers of this people. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Bronisław, who married a woman from the Ain tribe, still live in Japan. Institute to study Piłsudski's legacy were established in Russia and Japan. A very interesting fact, Bronisław Piłsudski is most famous Polish person in Japan. And they know a few names, Wałęsa and Bronisław Piłsudski. His brother Marshal is not so he's not known in Poland. One of the most famous researchers is Benedict Dybowski, exiled in 1865. He was famous primarily for studying the fauna and myco and the peoples of Siberia, but also for his humanitarian activity in Kamchatka, where he worked as a government doctor. Until his departure for Kamchatka, Dybowski was supported in his research by Wiktor Godlewski, a naturalist and another exile after the January uprising. In the field of geography and geology, Jan Czerski, Alexander Czekanowski, January insurgents whose names are still visible on the map of Russia, have deserved great help. As you can see, the topic is extensive and complex. In addition to deportations, there were also so-called emigration there was also so-called emigration for bread. Poles got married, earned extra money, often stayed in Siberia and assimilated completely. And it was only once that family history said that my great-grandfather came from Poland. But let me just quote a quote from a man named Michał Orfanov, who visited Irkutsk in the 1870s and described the situation in the city of how Poles managed. For those who have lived in and have been in Great Britain in the last 15 years, the described state of affairs may seem strangely familiar. The hotel where we stayed was run by a Pole who was a political exile. All hotel service, from buffet to coachman, all Poles. You rent a cab driver, it turns out that he's also a political criminal. You enter a butcher, dairy, tailor, shoemaker, any craftsman or petty shopkeeper, political everywhere, victims of the Polish uprising. Poles had a definite advantage in the medical world, in the bar, among clerical staff, in gold mines. Shops with ready-made clothes and footwear, restaurants and halter were absolutely Polish. I related to Great Britain, especially London, where I used to live. There was a time when every coffee shop or pub or hotel, you could start speaking Polish, and there was somebody who was there from Poland working there. About the Poles exiled or spread out throughout the world. You can read about it in my blog, Śladami Polaków dookoła świata, in the footprints of Poles around the world. So I encourage you to like my web on Facebook. Of course, there is an English version. And that's all for today.
Bardzo dziękuję, Marcinie. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, before we break for lunch, please don't...
Zanim rozejdziemy się na obiad,
fotografii, zdjęcia grupowej. Panowie wysocy z tyłu, a dzieci z przodu. Kilka rzędów, proszę, i pan Greg nam zrobi fotografię grupową. Potem pójdziemy na obiad. So please come up to the stage. Photograph. Mam nadzieję. Nie wyjdzie chyba. Może być tu na pewno. Please come up to the stage. Marcin, sorry, you're blocking the way. Please come up to the stage. Just let's make a passage and come up, please. The faster we do this, the faster we go to lunch. Come on, Mark. Mark near 2 bits. And Come on, Mark, we need you in the back. Barney, y'all come on up. Y'all come on up to the stage. Can we have our interpreters come downstairs? Anastasia, Renata, zapraszamy, proszę do fotografii. Renata, jest Anastasia? Okay, great. Come on up. Pani z kawą? Przepraszam. Excuse me, lady with the coffee. Pani z kawą, zapraszamy. Zapraszamy na scenę. Nie słucha? Aha. Nie posłuszna. No okej. Zapraszam. A nie do samego, bo tam są sami wysocy. Greg, how much do we need to squeeze together? We're good? Proszę pani, zapraszamy. Zapraszamy wszystkich. Może jeden rząd krzeseł? Albo jeden rząd może... Aha. Będziemy musieli podnieść, prawda? Now, Greg, will we see the sign? How high do we need to lift it up?
O, uwaga, uwaga, na nogi. Uwaga. Zapraszam. Okej, dobra.
Okay, Ivana, we're waiting for you now.
Ale nie zdążyliśmy do kosmetycznej kwestii.
Jeżeli nie zdążyłem kosmetycznie, to zdjęcie. Proszę pana, zapraszamy do zdjęcia. Patryk, przejdź do zdjęcia. Stań tam z boku. Tell people to move their heads or backs, shuffle over. You gotta move back. Jeszcze nie, jeszcze nie. Musi się cofnąć troszkę, bo jest aż tak dużo. Okay. Is the sign straight or crooked?
Stands crooked.
Lift it up on your side.
Or down on your side.
Troszkę wyżej. Proszę troszkę wyżej. This good? Okay. Okay, lunch is downstairs like yesterday. Obiad na dole tak jak wczoraj.